Hello everyone, so this is the second lecture video concerning this competency and this 3 learning objectives. So in the previous lecture video I talked about the science behind sustainability, and in this lecture video I will be talking about the last 2 learning objectives, which is the guiding principles and differences between sustainability and conservation and preservation initiatives. Okay, so first of all, we already hopefully know it at this point that life on the planet relies on the sun, right? We also know that the other process, that other ecosystem process that's essential for life is nutrient cycling, right? So which is this one. And again, nutrient cycling, you already saw some cycles, biogeochemical cycles. We've seen, hopefully you've seen the water cycle, the carbon cycle, all right, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, so on and so forth. So again, these are very, very important for life on the planet. So in sustainability, one of the key tenets, which are, or in this case, the principles behind sustainability is copying nature, right? So we do not need to reinvent what already works. So the planet, right, has gone on for many, as we know, millions and billions of years, okay, that we actually can just rely, in this case, could just copy what nature does very effectively. So reliance on solar energy. So one of the things is, this is about energy, right? So instead of relying on fossil fuels, which is like in this case oil, right, natural gas, why can't we just get all of our energy from the sun? So that is one of the big drivers of sustainable practices, is going to solar power and wind power, right? Wind, by the way, again, as I mentioned in the previous lecture video, is actually also dependent on the sun. Again, so the heat, what happens is when you have an area in which you actually have heat and cold, that's called a weather front, what happens is you actually create a lot of wind, okay? So that's actually what we're talking about when we talk about wind. So that is why when we talk about the green economy, we're talking about primarily about, again, solar and wind. And an interesting about solar energy is the amount of radiation, of heat energy that actually comes from the sun, right, is actually more energy than all of the, in this case, all of our perceived fossil fuel, in this case, reserves, right? So there is more energy in one day given to us by the sun than all of the fossil fuels combined on this planet. So could you imagine if you can harness that energy, right? The problem is, of course, batteries, but we're not going to talk about that issue at this point. So that's one principle of sustainable practice. The other thing is nutrient cycling, right? We want to make sure that nutrient, in this case, goes back between compartments, between the biotic, living compartments, abiotic, non-living compartments, at the proper amount of time, right? How do you see nutrient recycling? Well, wastewater treatment is a type of nutrient recycling that we have been doing for many years, okay? So water, obviously we need to consume clean water. And obviously we don't want dirty water into Lake Michigan, because we don't want to be drinking dirty water from Lake Michigan, which then creates all of these problems. So what we do is we've been treating water. So we've been cleaning up water before we dump them into the lake. And we've been cleaning up water before we even take them into our, in this case, into our utilities, in this case, for water utilities. So we have been using nutrient recycling for many years already. So wastewater treatment is just one concept that is related to that, okay? Now, these 2 other things is probably, in this case, foreign or new to a lot of us, okay, a lot of you. But biodiversity is somewhat of a, I guess, is a very complicated set. Biodiversity means to say that you need all of these actors in an ecosystem in order for a system to survive, in order for a system to thrive. So I'll give you an example right now. We're going to talk about New Orleans here. So for many, many years, okay, there's a delta. There's actually, New Orleans, as we know, is actually by, in this case, by the Gulf, okay? And what happens is there used to be a marsh that actually abuts. So here's New Orleans. Let's say, oops, sorry about that. So let's say this is New Orleans and this is the ocean here, okay, or the Gulf. They used to have like marsh, okay? And what happened is that marsh, when wave tides, because of extreme weather, hits the marsh actually dampens, it actually kills off the energy from the waves so that not a lot of energy actually penetrates, in this case, gets to New Orleans, right? Well, what happens is because of the wetland degradation, marshes are also called wetlands. What happens then is when huge waves come, guess what happens? All of that energy is directly translated into New Orleans, and actually that's what happened during, in this case, Katrina, right? So again, the other thing about biodiversity you have to think about is this: think about you playing in a team. And we all know how many people play in a basketball team? 5, right? Or how many people play in a soccer field or a football field? 11. Well, those 11 actors or those 5 actors is what we call as diversity. What happens if you're playing in a soccer game and 2 of you get kicked out because of penalties? Or you fouled out in basketball, so now you have 3 players instead of 5. That is no competition, right? So think about that. So you need all of the players in the team, right, playing in order for you to have good results. If players in your team gets lost, and again, in terms of biodiversity, we're talking about, you know, the birds, okay, the plants, all right? So those are all players in our team. If we lose players in our team, then the impact, the negative impacts of whatever happens in nature then becomes amplified or becomes bigger, all right? So bad things happen when you lose players. So that's actually the very, very bottom line summary of biodiversity. And then population control. Population control, right? It applies to all other animals except for humans, obviously. But okay, that was a sarcastic comment. Please don't take that, okay, too seriously. So population control. Now, what happens is it's all about resources. When you have a lot of food, there's a lot of life. When you don't have a lot of food, you don't have a lot of life. That's basically what population control is. So another example again that I mentioned about previously in this case is actually about positive and negative feedbacks. We already know about that, right? So we know for a fact when there's a lot of food, all right, whoever are the consumers of that food source, their population increases, right? However, as that population increases, they eat more of the food that they rely on, right? And in consequence, the food source declines, and then of course the population of the consumer then declines because they die off because they don't have enough food, right? Now, this is probably an untouchable subject in terms of sustainable practice because obviously we do not wish to, in this case, perform population control on humanity, right? In that extreme regard of we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about like obviously, all right, so I'm not gonna go there, but there are other ways that you can actually gain population control for humans. And what that is we know for a fact that the more poverty stricken you are, the higher your number of children. This is actually so, like, now this is not 100% true all the time, but if you look at it, the exploding population centers in the world are developing countries, right? We're talking about India, right? We're talking about Vietnam. We're talking about the Philippines, okay? We're talking about Mexico. We're talking about all of these other countries. The population growth in the United States for, in this case, Americans who have been in this country for hundreds of years and Europeans have been declining, all right? So one of the ways that you have to do that is there is actually a relation between poverty and population growth, okay? So unluckily, the problem with high population growth in developing countries, ladies and gentlemen, is there's not a lot of resources in developing countries. So what happens is there are no environmental controls, there are no environmental policy that actually happens in the developing countries. So then therefore there's a lot more pollution, right? There's a lot more degradation of natural resources, right? There's a lot more fossil fuel consumption on those countries that are actually exploding in population. So we need to think about that a little bit. So population control is not just species dying off, right, because of resources, but you can actually mitigate it a little bit also in terms of the human side of things. All right. So in the olden days, and we still do this in some regards, we have this practice called conservation and preservation. The only difference between them is actually shown here. In conservation, what happens is you actually don't overuse. You can use the things on the environment, like, so hunting is actually in this case is actually a conservation practice, because the number of deer, the number of game that you can bag every season is limited. You cannot go and shoot 100 deer or 50 bears, black bears at one time, right? You're only allowed a couple of tags a year, all right, every season. So that's an example of conservation control. Now, preservation means you don't touch it at all. All right. So that means you're not allowed in the area where the animals are. You're not allowed to touch them. You're not allowed to interact with them. Okay. So that's called preservation. Right. This is quite impossible to do, because in every nook of every corner of this planet, humans can go in there. Right. We can scuba dive. We can hike to areas in which there's no humans around. So this is somewhat of an impossible thing to do here. Now, just to give you conservation techniques are what we call habitat, okay, or organism or combined base practices. Okay, so what that means to say is, in habitat-based conservation, what you do is you concentrate on the area in which the species actually live. Okay, if it's a species-based, we're talking about the actual species here, talking about rabbits, right? When we're talking about habitat, we're talking about the environment that the rabbits live in. Okay, and then we have combined approach, in which we talk about both. You need to take care of the animal, take care of the area that it lives in. That's called a combined-based approach. Okay, again, quite impossible to do preservation, but conservation is definitely going on right now. All right. Now, right now we have the modern era of sustainability, and in the old era of conservation versus preservation, we talked about single players in the system. In sustainability approaches, we're talking about the whole system, and the shortcut for this approach, which is the modern sustainable approach, is called the 3 Ps. Every time that we see a problem in the environment, instead of talking about conservation versus preservation, we need to think about the 3 Ps. What is the effect on the planet? What is the effect on the people? What is the effect on profit? Right? Because people in our society needs to make money, right? So we cannot prohibit people to utilize the resource from the planet that actually gives them a livelihood, right? So imagine if we ban all types of fossil fuels in one day. Well, we have people who work in the automobile industries. We have people who work for, in this case, for oil, like for oil-based industries, like from the Dakotas, right? We have all of these people, right, who are utilizing a resource from the planet, fossil fuels, to make, now we shouldn't say profit, but to make money, to make a livelihood, right? We don't want those people to suddenly just crush, like just be removed from society and not have any means of livelihood, right? So that is one of the reasons why, when we talk about sustainability, it's much more complex than the old conservation versus preservation approaches, right? Because what happens is we have to weigh all 3 of them, and sometimes there are instances in which people comes first, right? There are certain times in which planet comes first, obviously, but it's all a balancing act. So this is I call this the Goldilocks approach. Not too much, not too little. We need to just think about every solution as just right. The other problem with the sustainable approaches is, when we emphasize one thing, it can sometimes negatively affect other portions of this 3 Ps. Right, so it's a little bit more complex approach